Welcome back, y'all. We're back in holy grounds in Mace Hall at First Baptist Church, Lancaster. First Baptist Church is a multi-ethnic blend of believers gathering in this relaxed worship style, and we even have a relaxed dress code, which allows us to simply gather to study God's Word and come before Him in worship and adoration. Today we continue through the study of the book of Ruth. Last week, I wanted to know why Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion, and Orpah were only mentioned in the first chapter of the book of Ruth. We found that Elimelech was a man who thought he was destined to be king, but his lack of faith and even his scorn of the people in Bethlehem during the famine, and then moving his family to Moab, deserting those very people he dreamed of ruling over. Elimelech died while the family was in Moab, leaving Naomi a widow. Mahlon and Chilion died in Moab and left their wives, Orpah and Ruth, widows. Orpah, Naomi's daughter-in-law, left her and returned to her home in Moab and her gods. We saw Orpah's lack of conversion from idol worship, lack of compassion for Naomi, and lack of faith of God. As a result, God rejected her. So would you consider all of these a consequence of their actions? So today I want to look at how many times in our lives when things start to get a little unsure or uncomfortable that we have rejected God's laws to find ourselves in the middle of the consequences. When we run from our problems, we never fully face the realities of our lives. We cannot resolve our problems if we do not deal with the problems. Perhaps we can make a correlation with our consequences of running from our problems to the downward spiral of Naomi's suffering, as she was tested by the losses in her life. Despite her questioning, we see how God blesses Naomi's faith. As we saw Jacob wrestling with the angel of God until the angel blessed him, we see Naomi wrestling with God for the sake of self-preservation. Ruth is also fighting battles every day to go to work in the fields to gather grain, a work which was ultimately lead to the preservation of a royal line of Israel. These two women, who their world believed had lost their ability to contribute, were chosen by God, whose purpose for humanity is riding on their shoulders. Naomi and Ruth live in a patriarchal culture that has a habit of devaluing women and girls. Men praised God that they had not been born female, a world where women were judged on their ability to bear sons. The Bible is full of stories of barren women. Sarai, who God renamed Sarah, who was 90 years old when Isaac was born. Genesis 17:16. Rebekah waited 20 years to give birth to Esau and Jacob. Genesis 25, 24, and 26. Rachel, Jacob's wife, who was tricked into working for 14 years to earn the right to marry her and then to compete with her sister Leah before the birth of Joseph, that was in Genesis 30, 22, 24. Going on, Anna, wife of Elkanah, who prayed for years before Samuel was born. 1 Samuel 1, 17 through 20. We also see Elizabeth, who was the wife of Zacharias, who gave birth to John the Baptist in her old age, in Luke 1, 11 through 17. Barren women in the Old and New Testament had no recourse to restore their lack of fertility, which was viewed as an entirely female problem. For Abraham, Jacob, and Elkanah, the solution was to father children by other women, likely causing even more despair and suffering to their wives. Readers skim past Ruth's and Orpah's infertility, which was camouflaged beneath their husband's death, and Naomi's return to Bethlehem. As we mentioned in the first week, neither Orpah or Ruth had conceived a grandchild. The deaths of Mahlon and Chilion seal the fate of Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, perhaps creating one of Naomi's greatest fears, that God was not on her side. Ruth 1:21 tells us that she went away full, but the Lord has brought her back empty. So how can God compensate Naomi for her losses? We've also compared Naomi to Job, and we also can question, how can God make up for Job's losses of his children and everything but his wife? So today we see that Naomi is learning to have faith, trusting God for who He is, and not because there is a balance sheet that God maintains to make things equal out. Faith may want answers, but somehow faith is not able to survive without them. Does Naomi's suffering open her eyes to see more of God than had she recognized before her tragedies? Naomi questioned God because she believed that He had left her. The author tells us that suffering is a sacred meeting place between God and His child, where faith is fighting to survive and God's goodness comes into question. Today we examine the barren women of the Bible, women who found themselves in the middle of a mess. We see their inward despair. These women discovered things about God. Had they not been forced into the darkness that was imposed upon them by no fault of their own, the infertility of the women in the darkness where no one goes, by choice, God meets them there. In their darkness, straining to see Him, listening intently for the slightest sound that would indicate that He is there. Naomi shows us how God's resurrection power leads her from Moab back to Bethlehem. How does Naomi explain what happened to the powerful Elimelech family? Even while Naomi was questioning God about all of the events of the famine that drove the family away, even despite all the questioning, God chose Naomi to be the evangelist. How could Ruth choose to convert to Naomi's God, Yahweh, and leave her homeland and go with her to Bethlehem? Continuing on their journey to Bethlehem, despair, Naomi, and hope, Ruth, took with them not only their belongings, but also their theology and what we would call baggage. When we move, when we leave home, when we change jobs, when we encounter difficulty, people flee. But we always take our baggage. And we don't seem to be comfortable without our baggage. So what does that say about our faith when we refuse to let go of our baggage? Their beliefs will be revealed in how they choose to live. The two Elimelech widows finally arrive in Bethlehem, bringing with them broken lives with nothing to offer, and it is presumed by society that they will be a drain on Bethlehem's resources. But what is unseen is God's resurrection power that is at work in their lives. Breaking the rules in Bethlehem. Oh, little town of Bethlehem. This will be a day that the people of Bethlehem will look back and see as a turning point of Israel's history. Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, Ruth 1:22. As the men and families returned from attending the festivals of Passover and unleavened bread and offering the first fruits of barley harvest on the Feast of First Fruits at Yahweh's temple in Shiloh, Joshua 18:1. Upon their return, the entire village is committed to harvesting the barley crop from dawn to dusk, which in ancient Israel took place in early spring. According to the law, the first grain of the barley harvest was to be brought to Yahweh's temple and offered at the altar of sacrifice on the first day of the week of the Feast of First Fruits during the Holy Week of the Pilgrim Feast of Unleavened Bread. Leviticus 23:5-14. At that time, the offerer places the grain offering before Yahweh's altar and made a profession of faith. Yahweh heard our voice and saw our misery, our toil and our oppression, and Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with His mighty hand and outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders. He brought us here and has given us this country, a country flowing with milk and honey. Hence, I now bring the first fruits of the soil that you, Yahweh, have given me. It seems ironic that Naomi, despair, and Ruth, hope, arrive in Bethlehem at the time of harvest. In the Old Testament, in an agrarian society, celebration of the harvest was people's response to God for the planting and reaping. Had the Elimelech family sown harvest of failure? Perhaps they had sown a harvest of grief. Had Orpah sown God's rejection when she left Naomi and returned to the gods of Moab? How different is Ruth's harvest because her faith in God that she barely knew. Harvest has always been an important part of life on earth, even in our advanced technological age that we live in. Harvest is still vitally important. Without a harvest, we cease to live. Such was the case for Naomi and Ruth. Without Ruth working in the harvest, they will perish. We are moving toward what will become Naomi's harvest, when finally God will provide the end of her suffering. Harvest is also a metaphor for spiritual growth, as we can find in 2 Corinthians 9:10 and James 3:18. Naomi and Ruth's harvest is being prepared by God. Ruth was an Azer, a woman who embraced the battles put before her. We learned in the first week of our study that God created Eve with a mission as the Azer to be Adam's staunchest ally in a life of faith. Can we now see how God created Ruth with a mission to fulfill? When she and Naomi arrive in Bethlehem, the city of bread, they are greeted by hunger, the same enemy that had driven the Elimelech family out of Bethlehem 10 years before. They were in a desperate situation, and if they were going to survive, Ruth must work. The laws of Yahweh is that He is the rightful owner of the land with authority to extend the gifts of His land to whomever He chooses to extend those gifts. The land will not be sold absolutely, for the land belongs to me, and you are only strangers, tenants, and a guest of mine. Leviticus 25:23. The poor had the protection under the law to glean, but permission to glean in an owner's field was not always willingly guaranteed. Ruth's position is tenuous because she does not have a man of her family to protect her, and she's also a foreigner. So before we go on to the good part, Ruth and Boaz, we're still holding back on that. There's a real life story of Naomi, despair, and Ruth, hope, and the baggage that they brought with them from Moab. We assume that both Naomi and Ruth are battling depression from the traumas that they each have experienced. How many of us experience days when even getting out of bed is overwhelming? How do we carry on with life after losing a loved one? So arriving in Bethlehem, Naomi changed her name to Mara, meaning bitter, in Ruth 1:13. Perhaps as camouflage? Returning to Bethlehem in defeat and embarrassment. The Elimelech family were important upper status people, and she was the wife of Elimelech, who believed that he was going to become the king of Israel. So to fall to such a lowly stature of widow after losing everything she had. Naomi continues battling with the misconception that God has turned against her. Like Naomi, hopelessness weighs us down. Philip Yancey said, "Pain narrows vision. The most private of sensations forces us to think of ourselves and little else." Overwhelmed by her bitterness and despair, Naomi shuts down. At the same time, Ruth, facing her own despair, but with her vow of loyalty to care for Naomi until she dies, sends her in a different direction. Ruth, the Azer, has chosen to no longer think of herself or to chase the dream of happiness. Her only priority is Naomi. Now energized by her faith in Yahweh, Ruth will do whatever it takes to protect and provide for Naomi. Instead of shutting down, Ruth, hope, turns outward and mobilizes. Ruth 2:1-3, Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, well-to-do and of Elimelech's clan. His name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, Let me go into the fields and glean ears of corn in the footsteps of some man who will look on me with favor. She replied, Go, daughter. So she set out and went to glean in the fields behind the reapers. Boaz, Naomi's kinsman, is introduced into the story, and we've been waiting on him for a couple weeks now. He needs to show up. He's the kinsman of the same clan as Naomi's husband, which we assume was the clan of Epaphrathah, which we studied in Ruth 1:1. Boaz is a man of high social status and wealth in the Bethlehem community. And it's unusual. His name means strength. And it is a name that is found in other passages in the Old Testament. Naomi's kinsman Boaz is named in the genealogy in 1 Chronicles 2:11 and 12. And Boaz is the name that will be given to the left column that supported the portico of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 7:21. By contrast, Elimelech was a man of weakness who abandoned his people in their time of distress. But Boaz, a man of strength, remained with his people. Like the other names in the book of Ruth, which we covered in the past weeks, Boaz is a reflection of Boaz the man. Boaz is powerful. Naomi and Ruth are powerless and vulnerable. Boaz's wealth and influence in the village are in stark contrast to Naomi and Ruth's poverty and hunger. In the patriarch world, Boaz holds all the cards, while Ruth and Naomi are empty-handed. In this section of the book of Ruth, Boaz is known only to us, the reader, and the narrator. Both Naomi and Ruth are unaware that Boaz is about to enter the picture. Society in this period was divided into states, tribes, clans, families. The clan consisted of families descended from a common ancestor, and that was the most important unit in the Israelite society. Boaz was a descendant of Nahshon, the Judahite prince, who was the nephew by marriage of Aaron, Moses' brother, who was Israel's first high priest. Nahshon was the chieftain of the tribe of Judah, chosen by God to lead the march of the 12 tribes during the 40 years of the wilderness journey. Boaz was also a descendant of Rahab, the Canaanite heroine of Jericho, who saved the Israelite spies and became a convert and married Nahshon's grandson Solomon. Exodus 6:23, Numbers 1:7, Ruth 4:20, 1 Chronicles, Matthew, Joshua. He's listed a lot of places in the Bible. So biblical genealogists list Solomon as Boaz's father and Rahab as his mother. Biblical genealogies often list only prominent names, and they skip generations, much in the same way in which Jesus is called, quote, the son of David, even though there were hundreds of years between the birth of David and the birth of Jesus. Under the law of the Sinai covenant, it was Ruth's right to glean in the fields of Bethlehem. Gleaning will be the means by which she will feed Naomi and herself. According to the law, provisions were made for widows and orphans and foreigners living in the promised land so that no one would be destitute among the covenant people, but they must work. There's no free ride, no welfare as we know it, no social security, no crutches to hold them up. There was work. We are familiar with the verse in the Bible, when you reap the harvest of your land, you will not reap to the very edge of the field, nor will you gather the gleanings of the harvest, nor will you strip your vineyard bare, nor pick up the fallen grapes. You will leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am Yahweh your God. Leviticus 19, 9 through 10. Ruth is God's image bearer. After becoming a follower of Yahweh, Ruth instinctively reflects a passion, and a purpose to become more like God. Ruth gives up her life on the road to Bethlehem for Naomi. We now see in the barley field how Ruth's fearless attitude makes a difference when Yahweh is present in the barley field. Ruth 2, verses 3 through 4. Chance led her to the plot of land belonging to Boaz of Elimelech's clan. Boaz, as it happened, had just come from Bethlehem. Yahweh be with you, he said to his reapers. Yahweh bless you, they replied. This day is a turning point in Ruth's life. These verses are the first of several examples of the providence of God working in the lives of Ruth and Naomi. What appears to be by chance that Ruth was unknowingly in a field that belonged to Naomi's kinsman, by chance Boaz just happens to visit his workers as Ruth is gleaning, and it just happens to notice that Ruth, it's not by chance, but all a part of God's divine plan. It is a reminder that God is the hero of this story. Boaz's greeting, invoking Yahweh's covenant name, is both a greeting and a blessing for his workers who are under Yahweh's protection. Notice how frequently Yahweh's name is used by the people in the story. Indeed, when God identified himself to Moses as Yahweh, a name used by Abraham in Genesis 15:2, he told Moses, "This is my name for all time, and thus I am to be invoked for all generations to come." Exodus 3:15. At this time, there was no invented pious restriction against using God's personal covenant name. By the 1st century AD, God's name was only uttered aloud in the daily liturgical worship services. Verse 5, Boaz said to a servant, the young man of his who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" And the servant in charge of the reapers replied, "The girl is the Moabitess who came back with Naomi from the plains of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and pick up what falls from the sheaves behind the reapers." Thus she came here, and she stayed with hardly a rest from morning until now. Ruth's request to the foreman in verse 7 to follow behind the reapers and to glean from what falls from the sheaves according to the law. She would not glean from the dropped stalks of the reapers, but from the sheaves that had been tied in bundles and set upright. This will limit her take, but it assures the foreman that she will not take advantage of his generosity in allowing her to glean in the field. So the foreman reports this to his master, that Ruth, the young Moabitess, who, remember, the Israelites and the Moabites were enemies. So she had returned with Naomi, and she was respectfully requesting to glean in the field after the stalks have been sheaved. The foreman notices Ruth is a hard worker. She's worked without stopping, gathering the gleanings left by Boaz's workers, and Boaz too must have been impressed. He had already heard about Ruth and her devotion to Naomi from the other village women, Ruth 2:11. Boaz's workers were not slaves, but free Israelites or visiting foreign workers who hired themselves out to work in the harvest for an agreed upon wage. God's providence brought Boaz and Ruth together, but now the next step was up to Boaz. How would he, the wealthy Israelite nobleman, respond to this destitute foreign girl? I think we'll stop here today and pick up next week with the rest of the story. Today at work, while I was going through my papers getting ready to present the program, I found a little piece that was about Ruth, and it spoke to me, so I just want to share this with y'all. And it says, "A modern day Ruth is one who has been hurt but has persevered and continued to walk in love and faithfulness. She found strength she didn't realize that she had. She gives herself deeply from her heart and tries to help and bless others wherever she goes. And that was written by Ruby Wives. So if you would join me in a quick prayer in closing for today. Dear Lord, we come to you now and we thank you for being our creator and our protector and our provider. And I ask you now to enlighten us what is dark in us, to strengthen what is weak in us, to mend what is broken in us, and to bind what we are bruised from, and to heal the sick. And lastly, I ask that you would to revive the peace and love that people seem to have lost in our time of grief and exile and our uncertainty of days that we've been living through. And we ask all these things in your name. Amen. So I have one more thing to share with you. Ruth shows us that God's family is built on faith, not nationality. Ruth is a non-Israelite from Moab, and she becomes the ancestor of Jesus. Also, God's provision often comes through the love and faithfulness of his obedient servants. And the last one, Boaz's redemption of Ruth foreshadows Christ's redemption of his people. I hope you have a good week, and I will see you next week.